Adrienne Gold-Davis, and I want to welcome you to this painful but vital three-part Momentum Boost series. We're going to be exploring the origins of modern anti-Semitic language and learning why anti-Semitism is on the rise in college campuses and indeed across the world. So a common definition of anti-Semitism is the hostility to, prejudice, or discrimination against Jews. A person who holds such positions is called an anti-Semite. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism that is as old as our faith itself. And in these times of heightened consciousness about racist attitudes and behaviors, it is very curious and painful that anti-Jewish attitudes seem exempt from that conversation. You see, thinking about hate is hard, but to recognize and combat it, we need to understand where it comes from and how it affects us and our loved ones. Language matters. That's why when we talk about hatred, it's important to have a clear definition of what it is and how it masquerades itself in modern speech. We're going to explore the historical context behind three very divisive phrases: anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Israel sentiment. What do they mean? Where did they come from? And how are they used, actually weaponized, today? This three-part series has graciously been made possible by the Russell Berrie Foundation. And I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions, and we'll get to them later as part of the discussion. So please make sure you write them in the chat function throughout, and we're going to keep track of all of them. So today we're blessed to be led by an expert in this field, a woman with a depth of understanding and years of experience. Dr. Rachel Fish is founding executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism. Robert Kraft, who is the owner of the New England Patriots, established this foundation to catalyze dynamic new solutions to stop this age-old hatred advanced by those who seek the elimination of Judaism and the Jewish people and the modern movement to destroy the world's only Jewish state. Before this, Dr. Fish was most recently senior advisor and resident scholar of Jewish Israel philanthropy at the Polly Singer Foundation in New York City. She worked closely with grantees to support them and provided framing around their educational content and their programming. She also aided in developing strategy for the Foundation's Jewish Israel philanthropy. Dr. Fish was also the executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University, where she helped train the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. She's taught at Brandeis, at Harvard, at UMass Amherst, and in adult Jewish education programs. And in 2015, Dr. Fish held the Rohr Visiting Professorship at Harvard University, where she lectured on modern Israel and received the Derek Bach Certificate of Teaching Excellence. She is co-editor with Ilan Tron of the book Essential Israel: Essays for the 21st Century. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Fish.
Thank you so very much. It's truly a pleasure to be part of the Momentum Boost series, and thank you to the Russell Berrie Foundation for the opportunity to participate in the discussion around anti-Semitism and how it has transformed over time. So this evening, I'm going to focus on the historical conversation of anti-Semitism. I'm actually going to put a presentation up in just a moment. And after the presentation, I welcome the questions and the conversation between all of us. So let me put this in presentation mode, and hopefully everyone can see. We're going to really do a deep dive in trying to understand how anti-Semitism has transformed over time. And I'm going to, again, try to provide a broad sketch of these issues, knowing that you could teach a class for about 13 weeks, a course. But we're going to at least begin to get the contours of this subject area. So let's begin. When we first begin to see anti-Jewish sentiment, We begin to see it during the development and the emergence of Christianity in Europe. Now, when we begin to see the anti-Jewish sentiment or Judeophobia, what we are seeing is that within a Christian context and a European context, the theological framing within Christianity suggests that Jews, as the chosen people who have a special brit covenant with God, is no longer actually the chosen people, because there is now a new covenant that supersedes the old covenant, the old relationship. And therefore, this new covenant takes precedence. And this new covenant is with Christians. We begin to see in this context that many of the ideas around Judaism are deemed to be not necessary. We see that the church fathers are concretizing an anti-Jewish sentiment that is emerging. We see this, the writings by the church fathers who begin to actually put on mock trial the rabbis to defend the Jewish religious texts of Judaism. And during these disputations, the rabbis are asked to defend Jewishness. And when they are asked to defend Jewishness, there are polemical debates that emerge that we can read the sermons from and the disputations from medieval Europe at this time. And it becomes very clear that the church, the Catholic Church, is trying to create an atmosphere around making it clear that the Jews ought to be excluded from the society in which they are living. Now, it's not only the Catholic Church and the church fathers who are putting forth these positions, and we begin to see that as early as, the 4th century through the medieval period, but it's also in terms of the leadership of the empires and then the kings who are considered to be divinely ordained. They get their power from God. Catholicism and Christianity is a major part of that divinity that has selected them. And the state, emerging state, but the empire policies, the kingdom policies, are ones in which they utilize their power in order to marginalize Jews within the kingdoms. Jews can only live in certain areas. It's in Italy that you begin to see the first ghettos that are formed for the specific purpose of showing the Jews that they are excluded from society, that the host society determines when those gates to the ghetto doors will be opened, because it is the monarchy who locks those doors at night. It is also very clear that it's not just in terms of where Jews live, but it's in terms of where they will be able to have professions, the limitations of those professions, and how they will be integrated or not integrated into society. Bottom up, because of some of the hostility that is being stoked from the leadership, the church, and from the government, we see bottom up a mob-like mentality that begins to form that uses Jews as a scapegoat because they are different in terms of their religious practices. So many of you will be familiar with the idea of the blood libel. The blood libel is the idea that Jews are accused, it's a lie, that they are seducing the children of Christians for the purpose of using the Christian children's blood for ritual practices within Judaism. So this kind of image, which is from a woodcutting in the 15th century, depicts Simon of Trent, a child, being held up by Jews, surrounded by Jews. You can tell with the way in which their noses are depicted. Some of them are holding money bags, and they are making sure that this child has no ability to leave. They are harming the child with knives, draining the child's blood so that that blood can be used for ritual practices. Now, some of you may say, who really saw these images? Where did these images come from? But even in the Grimm fairy tales, the idea of anti-Semitism exists. This is an illustration from the Grimm fairy tales of the story of Hansel and Gretel, a story many of you are familiar with. And here you have the witch who is trying to seduce Hansel and Gretel to come into her house in order for her to harm them. The witch in this case is depicted as a Jew. Jews were seen as being nefarious, as being cruel, as looking to seduce these children. And if you remember the story of the Grimm fairy tales, what ultimately happens is Hansel and Gretel push the witch, i.e. the Jew, into the oven for the purpose of making sure that they aren't harmed, and she burns in the oven. The Nazis loved this story. The Nazis loved this story so much, in their minds, it helped make the case of why the crematoria actually were reasonable ideas. So this is just a way to show you how acceptable the trope of anti-Semitism was. And not only was it acceptable, but it becomes internalized within the societies in which Jews are living in Europe. We also know that Christianity perpetrates the myth and the lie that Jews ultimately killed Jesus. That claim of deicide is a claim that haunts the Jews for decades. And it's not until the Second Vatican Council in 1965, with the work of Nostra Aetate, in which the church actually says that they renounce that position. Jews are no longer held responsible for the killing of Jesus, and that the church does a mea culpa, a tshuva, and repents for that lie. But again, it's not until 1965. So during this period of time in medieval Europe, you are beginning to see the seeds being sown, suggesting that Jews are dirty, that they are the ones responsible for the bubonic plague, which is important because we'll talk about how that resonates today in the 21st century. Jews are the ones who are blamed for issues within the society. And there begins to be some of the stereotypical images of Jews that we now see playing out continuously since this period of time. Now, what is going on within the Arab world? It is quite different within the Muslim and Arab world. Relations between Jews and Muslims are actually much better than relations between Jews and Christians in Europe during this, early period of the development of Islam and into the medieval period. But it is still important to understand that Jews are considered to be different than the society in which they are living in the Muslim world. Jews, Christians are perceived as being Dar al-Kitab, people of the book. So there is a special status given to Jews and Christians. And it's a compliment because that means all three of these traditions are monotheistic. That being said, Jews still, because they were not Muslim, are given second-class citizenship with a status called dhimmi status. If you hold dhimmi status, similar with Christians as well, you have to pay a special tax called a jizya. Jews had to wear a yellow Star of David, reminiscent of what Jews wore during the Holocaust, to clearly identify themselves as Jews so they would not be mistaken to be Muslim. If you've ever been to parts of Spain, for example, you will notice that when you go into a synagogue in Spain, you have to go down the steps. That is because a synagogue cannot be the same height as a mosque. Jews could not ride horses because Jews had to be lower on an animal, so they rode donkeys, while Muslims rode horses. So this gives you a sense of, again, a differentiation in terms of identity. The other important concept that exists within the political theological framing within Islam is this notion of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam. Dar al-Islam is the realm of Islam. Anywhere where Islam, and you had Islamic rulers and the caliphate existed in a territory, was considered to be the realm of Islam. If you have a non-Muslim entity within the midst of the realm of Islam, then it's called Dar al-Harb, which is the realm of conflict. And it's incumbent upon these Muslims who hold this very particular strict understanding of political theological perspective in Islam that you engage in a conflict, in jihad, physical struggle with the non-Muslim entities. This becomes very important when we think about issues related to organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIL, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, and even within the Iranian government, in which Israel poses as Dar el-Harb because it is a non-Muslim entity in a region that is Dar al-Islam, the realm of Islam. So we'll come back to that towards the end of this conversation. Now, as we move from the period of the medieval time into the 18th and 19th and then later 20th centuries, the idea of the Jew and what the Jew represents begins to transform. It's not only just a dislike of the Jew because of the Jew's religion, but now it's a suggestion that Jews hold influence. Jews hold financial capacity. And with that financial capacity, they try to leverage it for the purpose of the benefit of Jews. So here you see an image of what looks like to be a spider with all of its legs, its ability to have reach into a lot of countries. It's labeled as the Rothschilds, which was a family from the United Kingdom, a philanthropic Jewish family. And here the suggestion is that Jews have this outsized proportional influence in order to promote their own particular agenda. That idea that's emerging in that 18th and 19th century period is the idea that it's not just about Jews as a religious group, but now it's about Jews as a people. And why this matters so much is because there were Jews who thought, if I could just shed my Jewishness, if I could just convert and no longer be part of the Jewish people religiously, then I would be accepted within the society in which I am living. And I wouldn't be bothered with this baggage anymore. But what's happening during the 19th century is that a pseudoscience called eugenics is beginning to exist. It's emerging. Eugenics is this idea that your DNA is immutable. And because your DNA is immutable, you have specific characteristics that that determine your ability, whether it's mental capacity, physical ability. And the idea that's emerging within Europe and specifically within Germany is this idea that you want to have as pure of blood as possible so that you can be as Aryan, as German as possible. And you don't want to have a mixing of DNA with anyone who doesn't have pure Aryan DNA. We know, obviously, that's not realistic, but that idea of blood connected to a territory, a soil, becomes very important in this radical form or extreme form of nationalism, which is promoting then a particular type of identity for a people, i.e. the Aryans, connected to a place. So for example, in this image, what you see is the territory of central Germany. And in this territory, you have the identity markers of what it looks like for those Aryans and those who are non-Aryan, and how do you keep purity of blood. This idea is an idea in the 19th century that is being promoted, and Jews realize that conversion then no longer solves their problem because they will still be connected because of their DNA to the Jewish people. Therefore, it means Jews will remain the other. And within many European writings during this period of time, what you find is that Jews are referred to as the Easterners, the Orientals, and the Semites. Now, Semite and the term Semite was actually a linguistic and geographical category. The area of what we would refer to as the Levant, or today the region of the Mediterranean, geographically shared linguistic roots. Think about language like Akkadian, Aramaic, Phoenician, Arabic, Hebrew. We know that these languages all rely on the root system, Shorashim, in order to develop the building blocks for their language. This marker of a linguistic and geographic location is transposed onto Jews in the European context to identify them as a people. Now, we often hear, well, Arabs are Semites too. And yes, according to this kind of framing, Arabs are Semites. They come from this territory as well. Their language comes from this territory as well. But the term Semite during this period of time was not used as a marker for Arabs in a European context. It was used as a marker specifically towards Jews. And so when you have anti-Jewish policies emerging, when you start to see the language in German of Antisemitismus, which is the term anti-Semitism coined by the German Wilhelm Marr, who's promoting anti-Jewish policies. He's saying what schools Jews can go to, what businesses they can and can't operate in, where they can live, where they can shop. That is when you begin to see how Jews are being not only sectioned off as different within society. This is when the czars and pogroms are taking place. This is when the armies are used for the purpose of violence and inciting violence specifically toward the Jewish community. And then, of course, we know what happens during the emergence of Nazism and when Hitler comes to power. And then, of course, the penultimate expression of the Holocaust. So now we see what it's like when there's a hatred of Jews because of their religion, and then a hatred of Jews because they are specifically a people. And you see that the Nazis in that process were indoctrinating youth as young as they possibly could in order to encourage mobilizing those individuals around the big lie. And if you repeat the big lie enough, it will eventually take hold and people will begin to believe it. And as we know, dehumanization results, demonization results, and ultimately humanity allowed mass murder to result. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't end Jew hatred with the Holocaust. What we see during the period of the late 20th, early 21st century is that now Jews are not only despised because of their religion or because they are seen as a particular type of people, but also Jews who identify with the collective identity of the Jews, and who desire self-determination, meaning a Jewish nation state, also can incur hostility. This hatred, I want to be very clear, is not the same as criticism of Israel. This is not about whether there should be a labor government, who should be in the Likud government, should there be settlements, where do you withdraw? This is not about, is there a possibility for a two-state relationship between Jews and Palestinians? That is not the conversation. That's a conversation that happens in Israel. It happens within the Arab sector of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox sector, the secular sector. It happens with Mizrahi, Jews from the Arab world or from Northern Africa. It happens with Ashkenazi, Jews from Europe. That is not the conversation. What I'm talking about is when the starting point is, does Israel have a right to exist? And when that is the starting point, and you begin to see the demonization, the dehumanization, and a double standard, the 3 Ds, which was a phrase coined by Soviet refusenik Natan Sharansky, who said when those 3 Ds emerge, we have to ask ourselves, what's really going on here? Why is it that this individual with whom I am speaking is trying to hold Israel to a double standard or is demonizing Israel in a way that they would never do to any other nation state or to any other people who desire self-determination? We also see this in terms of when Jews and Israelis, particularly outside of Israel, are held accountable and seen as an extension of Israeli policy, Israeli behavior, and asked, why is it that you care about this place when it perpetrates this policy or that policy? We rarely see other ethnic groups held responsible for decisions made by nation states, except in this case. We see it quite a bit. And the progressive conversation that's happening about many social issues that many of us care about, whether it's about the LGBTQ plus movement, whether it is about Black relations and people of color, whether it is about issues related to gender and women. Part of what is happening in those spaces is that if you talk about your identity as a Zionist or your love for the Jewish people and the love of the land of Israel and the state of Israel, you are deemed to no longer be progressive because it doesn't fit the narrative that has been constructed. So let me give you an example of a way in which this type of anti-Semitism exists. In this image, what you see is an Israeli soldier holding a weapon, and he is about, if he hasn't already, murdered an individual. This individual looks like Jesus wearing Palestinian sort of keffiyeh. Mother Mary is holding him. If you see the writing in the background, it says, "Do not kill him twice." This is the deicide charge, the idea that Jews killed Jesus, but now Jesus is the Palestinian. So this is an example, I would argue, of a form of anti-Semitism. And we see this all of the time in mainstream media. We see it in politics. We see it in the discourse that will happen on university campuses, which is a conversation we'll actually have next week. Now let's talk about how we see these expressions of anti-Semitism in America. From the political hard right, we know that there is a history of white supremacy in this country. And in that history, Jews are perceived as not being white. Jews are the other. And if you have spent time studying this subject, it is not just based upon skin color, but it is an understanding of that immutability of DNA that Jews clearly cannot be white. We also see coming from the hard political right, expressions of combining political ideas, such as from the Civil War and segregation and racism, with forms of neo-Nazism. For those of you who recall the insurrection that occurred on January 6th in our Capitol in Washington, D.C., this was an individual, and there were many of them, wearing shirts that these letters and numbers stand for 6 million weren't enough. This is part of the hard right. We also saw just a few weeks ago from a Kentucky governor, the idea that if you are getting a COVID vaccine, it is akin to the government in Europe putting a Jewish Star of David on you in order to clearly regulate the way in which you engage in society. So we have these Holocaust comparisons that exist, again, coming from a right of center position. And remember when I told you about the idea of Jews being dirty and blamed for the bubonic plague during the medieval period? Well, now Jews are blamed for COVID-19. Here is an example of a meme that was all over the internet during the early stages of COVID, in which this is supposed to be an image of what the COVID vaccine looks like under a microscope. And of course, the COVID vaccine is Jewish, and it's a nefarious looking Jew, an evil looking Jew, a big nose, wearing a kippah, and obviously causing terrible harm. But it's not only from the hard right, we also see anti-Semitism from the hard left. And what's interesting it's that it's the inverse of what we heard from the hard right, meaning on the hard left, Jews are perceived as being white, and if they are white, they're assumed to be privileged. And if they are assumed to be privileged, they are also assumed to be oppressive. They are part of the problem as colonialists and imperialists. And this goes to the conversation then of how that plays out within certain social movements that I made reference to before, in which Jews are excluded from those social movements because they are seen as being part of the oppressive powerful, and therefore they are not vulnerable and are not at risk. So we've got the hard right saying you're not white, you're the other, and the hard left saying not only are you white, you are privileged, you are oppressive, you are part of the problem, and therefore excluded from social movements that you care about. And we have seen how that exclusion takes place. There's a new term that's being used called erasive anti-Semitism. And that term suggests that Jewish voices, Jewish identity are being erased from the conversation and deemed not to have a place within the conversation because they are not understood to be a vulnerable minority. So let me give you an example. During Black Lives Matter, after the horrible murder of George Floyd, we saw this cartoon or image emerge, this illustration. Here you have an Israeli policeman who has his knee on the neck of a Palestinian. He is holding his American compatriot, an American policeman whose knee is on the neck of a man of color. The two policemen are embraced. Why? There is a movement called the Deadly Exchange, which suggests that American police spend time in Israel through a professional development opportunity to learn from Israeli police in order to engage in racial profiling so that they are better equipped to know how to racially profile and what tactics to use against people of color. Now, obviously, this is not true. This is another lie, but this is a depiction and gives you a sense of how this plays out on the hard left. We also see on the hard left images that suggest that the Israeli and the Jews not only use their powerful weapons, their military, their security barrier, but the Jews also use the access they have to COVID-19, which they created, in order to exclude, isolate, marginalize, and harm the Palestinian who lacks agency. So this is another depiction. So anti-Semitism today. What we're trying to do through the work at the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism is to think about how to make Jew hatred socially unacceptable in the 21st century. And we are trying to put Jew hatred in conversation and in relationship with other forms of discrimination, prejudice, and bias, primarily because anti-Semitism is not understood by many today. We also want to find ways to call people into a conversation so as to educate them more fully. Now, we are not spending our time focusing on the detractors, the haters, but the vast majority of the people are not actually haters. They're ignorant, they're misinformed, and they don't actually understand the contours of anti-Semitism. And they assume that anti-Semitism actually ended with the Holocaust. We're trying to create brave spaces and to help young people particularly understand how they can speak up when they hear something and say something in order to be upstanders. And in order to do that, we're encouraging individuals to hone their critical thinking skills and challenge the herd mentality that so often permeates so many channels within our society. And we also know, of course, that we need to build the muscle of compassion. We know that in order to engage with differences, you have to be willing to listen. You have to be uncomfortable with discomfort, with productive discomfort, but you do so from a place in order to learn and to engage in meaningful, substantial relationships. So that's what we're trying to do through our work. And that's what we're trying to do here with you this evening, in the hope that we will be able to work together to learn more about the ways in which anti-Semitism exists today, where it came from, and how it has manifested in the present. So I would welcome questions and a conversation with all of you.
Oh, Rachel, I was breathless through all that. I think I held my breath the entire time. You're so articulate, and it was so grim to me. Pardon my pun, because I'm going to go burn all those Grimm's fairy tales. I had no idea, none whatsoever. You know, that trope of a witch, the large-nosed, hook-nosed witch, I always thought that in The Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch looked vaguely Semitic. I wondered if that was a trope. Tell me a little bit about the yellow star for a minute. Do you think that the Nazis adopted the yellow star as a response to what was happening in Rome?
Yes, I think that, you see what worked in the past and you appropriate. And so what we know is that the Nazis didn't come up with it on their own. And it was a way to clearly mark people as being different. And that is the purpose of creating, practices that demonstrate exclusion. Because the more you exclude a particular group, the
Sure.
more you can begin to cultivate that hostility towards that group.
Well, this has been a trope since the very beginning. It's even in the Torah, right? This was the paradigm of what the Egyptians did to enslave the Israelites all the way back then. I have a bunch of questions from the audience, but of course, because I'm the host, I get to ask mine first. Why do you think that post-Holocaust, no one had the stomach for anti-Semitism, but that it's come roaring back? And why do you think in all of this new hyper-consciousness about racism and systemic racism and all of these things, that anti-Semitism never counts in that conversation?
Those are great questions. They're very, very strong questions. I'll say the following about the Holocaust. When we first begin to understand truly what happened during the Holocaust, remember, it's not till a couple of decades later. Holocaust survivors themselves are not speaking immediately, because how could you? This is one of the most inconceivable traumas in human history. 1 in every 3 Israeli is a survivor. So imagine in Israel, you see people all the time with the tattoos, but no one speaks of what those tattoos represent. It's not until the Eichmann trial in the late 60s that you begin to hear about the trauma of the Holocaust from survivors themselves. Now, American Jews actually have a complicated history with what was happening in Europe, because American Jews are feeling very guilty. American Jews weren't able to organize in the way that we are able to organize today. Remember, America is not the same America that Jews are living in.
Right.
There's anti-Semitism in this country, obviously different than the anti-Semitism that exists in Europe, but there is anti-Semitism. Jews are trying to figure out how do you actually acculturate and assimilate into this place. They are deeply concerned about being accused of a dual loyalty. So those are real pressures that exist. When it becomes more apparent what the Nazis actually perpetrated, you begin to see the world take this unbelievable gasp of air. Because suddenly it comes to the fore that humans allowed this to happen to other human beings. And this is when you begin to see terms like genocide emerge. And it becomes part of the vernacular, not only within the community, mainstream, but also in international law, because it sets a precedent in terms of what is crossing a line and what are the responsibilities of other states, of other governments in order to respond. Now, it doesn't take long, as you know, for memory to begin to dissipate.
I'll say.
Right? I mean, we know this even from sort of the events of September 11th, for those of us, right, who have been around. And what we realize is that all of a sudden, the Holocaust becomes ancient history to some. And not only that, there's a process in which the Holocaust and Holocaust education starts to be universalized.
Mm-hmm.
Now, no one is saying that you shouldn't teach about other genocides. Of course you should. But each genocide is unique and it has its own historical context. And what begins to happen with many educational programs around the Holocaust is it becomes diminished, watered down, so that it is universalized, and the particularism around the Jewishness is disregarded.
I see.
And that's had a profound impact on the way in which the Holocaust has been taught. Moreover, many of the organizations who do important work around Holocaust education, when you ask the teachers who have done those programs, they will say, I can tell you what happened historically in Poland in 1939. I can tell you what happened in Germany in 1942, but I can't tell you why Jews are being attacked in Brooklyn, or I can't tell you about what happened at the Tree of Life synagogue, or I can't tell you what's going on a college campus because I don't understand how to talk about that anti-Semitism.
See, I think this is the real dilemma. And somebody is asking here on the chat if you might be willing to talk a little bit, speaking of systemic racism, about the United Nations.
Sure. I mean, the United Nations is a very complicated entity, but we know that it's a very political entity. And as a political entity, it has for a very long time had a double standard towards Israel, right? When Israel can't be on the Human Rights Commission and China can, we have a problem, right? Or Russia, we have a problem.
Right.
And so that's when you really quickly understand that this is politics, and this is not about, human rights. This is not about humanity in any shape or form. Ben Gurion called the United Nations shmoo. He didn't take it seriously, right? Because he was like, this is not an institution that actually has moral credibility and will actually look at the Jews and care about the Jews. And it didn't, and it hasn't.
I have to tell you that in the last few years, one of the things I've noticed, especially with my less politicized family, nieces, nephews, that sort of thing, that there's plenty of Jews, young Jewish kids, who align themselves with the hard left, especially on campuses. And I think that's something you're going to discuss next week.
We are going to discuss that.
One of the things I want you to think about for them is whether or not we can prepare our children for that kind of thing. Do you feel that there is a time limit on sympathy for the Jews, if you will? One of the things that I have heard many, many times is, enough about the Holocaust already. That Jewish identity for the longest time has been so tied into never again and the Holocaust that people really didn't know what it meant to be a Jew. They just knew what it meant to be hated. So I suppose what I'm asking you is, how do we activate people to work against anti-Semitism without having their whole Jewish identity formed by they hate us, so what should we do?
It's a really important question. There's a lot of oi in Judaism, as we know. And at the same time, we don't want to forget that there's also a lot of joy in Judaism. And that's really important. And I'm a firm believer that you cannot create a meaningful, sustainable Jewish identity predicated upon anti-Semitism. It's actually highly problematic, especially the younger you go. Why would you want to be part of a people who's hated? That's like basic, social 101. Nobody wants to be part of a group that nobody likes. You want to be part of the winning society. You want to be part of the team that's, celebrated. So we have to change that conversation. The person I would say to turn to is the beloved, and may his memory be a blessing, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Yeah. Right? This was an individual who understood and could beautifully articulate all of the joy of Judaism. And not just the joy of Judaism, but the values that animate us as a people, right? We know that Jews are this incredible people that have a set of values to be engaged with, not just for our own community, but broadly. Right. So why that matters is because we care about both particularism, our own community, and universalism, the world beyond us, right? Israel is supposed to be aspirationally, right? And we can say that on its birthday as it's about to come to an end today, but it aspires to be Or LaGoyim, a light unto the nations. Israel is the epitome of the laboratory of particularism, Jewishness, and universalism, democracy. Now, that should be animating for anyone, because if you can see yourself as part of a collective, as part of a people that has a transnational history, that engages with multiple ethnic communities, that has multiple linguistic expressions, it is a pretty exciting community to be a part of.
Sure.
But if you're just the people who's persecuted, I don't think that's sustainable long term.
Yeah. Do you have time for two more quick ones?
Of course.
This chat function is blowing up. And I know you can't be with us for a lot longer. Thank God we have you for 2 more weeks. Why do Jews express anti-Semitic feelings within our own community?
It's a really hard question, but I want to say just 2 things about this, and we will go into this more in other sessions. But you have to remember that within our own community, there's a lot of internalized anti-Semitism at this point. And we're guilty of it, just like there are other communities guilty of also some of the internalized prejudices that they experience.
Right.
There's also, I think, within the conversation today, at least as well, there is also a sense that, well, I'm comfortable with this part, but I'm not comfortable with this. And we've become very a la carte in terms of creating individualized experience of what we want and being illiterate about so much of what we don't want. So I would say that, first of all, we have to build up our own literacy. And when I talk about building the muscle of compassion, I also mean that for our own community, meaning we all know that 2 Jews, 3, 4, 5 opinions, right? Like we know that. But I have to tell you, like growing up where I grew up in the small town in Northeast Tennessee, you learn very quickly, you have to get along if you're going to have a community, because there's only one synagogue and it has to fit everybody. So none of this like, well, I'm going to go to the synagogue that I would never go in, right? Like it doesn't work. So you have to learn that it doesn't matter if politically you're left of center, politically you're right of center, if you feel this way about a government, this way about, a certain policy. At the end of the day, we literally are all family. And you can have crazy Uncle Larry who makes you crazy, but you still have crazy Uncle Larry. So that's part of being a collective. And I think that we have gotten to a point in our own communal politics in which we have lost civility. We are unwilling to create and cultivate brave spaces internally within the Jewish community to really explore the complexity of all of the issues, whether it's around Jewishness, Judaism, peoplehood, Israel, whatever it may be. We have forgotten to learn how to listen. We are always reacting. We are constantly on defense. We always want to prove our point rather than just truly listening in order to have and build long-term sustainable relationships as Jews. I have to just tell you one little story. I know a lot of the people on this presentation are parents. And I just want to say, I'm a parent. I have 4 little kids. And my daughter is 6. And the other day, last week, it was Yom HaShoah. So I'm going to tell this quickly, I promise. So it was Yom HaShoah. And, we were listening to a Yom HaShoah tekes ceremony on Zoom. It was totally age appropriate, but, you start to hear the sad Holocaust music, right? And the second you hear that music, how much it hurts, right? Just to hear it, what's coming. So my daughter's listening. She's only 6. She doesn't know the details of what happened in the Holocaust. But she said, and she was totally in the moment, she said, they killed a lot of Jews, Ima. And I said, they did. It's a very terrible thing. And she said, and they also killed other people who weren't Jews. I said, that's right. And she said, well, who were they? And I said, people that weren't considered to be German enough. People who were gay, people who had disabilities. And so the Germans killed them the way they killed the Jews. And through huge sobbing crocodile tears, she said, God made us all special and different. Why don't they understand that? And this is a 6-year-old who gets it. This same child, as we were driving somewhere the other day, said, Ima, I just feel connected to the Jewish people. That's all we want. I want my kids to feel connected to the Jewish people because that is where I want them to place their bet. We are a people that is still here, not the Phoenicians, not the Akkadians, not the, other peoples from the Levant, but the Jews are. And we're here because our values and traditions and texts have persisted for millennia. It's not because people have hated us, it's because of the gifts that we bring to the world.
Rachel, you are a gift. You are a spectacular woman. And I am so looking forward to next week that I don't like to wish time away, but I cannot wait till next Thursday and the Thursday after you. You just, my gratitude is profound. I feel very terribly for everybody for whom I couldn't read your questions, but honestly, who among us wanted you to stop speaking? I know I didn't want you to stop. So I just really want to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Rach.
Thank you.
And to everyone else in Momentum Land, thank you for joining us today. We hope it was enlightening and educational and certainly moving. What an extraordinary speaker. And we've got her again for 2 more weeks. So join us next week, same time, same day for the second session. And if you have kids in high school or in college, please ask them to join because we're going to be talking about hatred in higher education, encountering anti-Semitism on campus. It's tough to be a college student these days, and it's even tougher when you're constantly on the alert for anti-Semitism, both the overt and the subtle. And it's in your classes, it's among your friends, and it's from your school administration as well. So we're going to explore the ways in which anti-Semitism presents itself in higher education and the complex historical and modern factors that can cause hostility towards Jewish identity on campus. And we'd also like you to join us next Monday at 8 p.m. because we have an incredible guest. He's a philanthropist extraordinaire. His name is Michael Steinberg. He thinks he's one of the world's luckiest guys. And it's with that attitude that he's become one of the world's leading philanthropists. He approaches every project with a vision for quality communities and Tikkun Olam. And he's going to join us and share the experiences that became the stepping stones to his success. And we can figure out how to search for our own life's changing moments and learn how to step up for others like he did. So if you just click on the right now in the chat, you can register there. And just take a moment to fill out the poll that comes up on your screens now. It takes like 1 second, and it really helps us give you the kind of programming that you need. But for me, Adrienne Gold Davis, and from all of us at Momentum, please remember that as we learn and grow and activate ourselves, take action in our communities, that the highest form of wisdom, the Talmud teaches this, but Dr. Fish's daughter understood it, that the highest form of wisdom will always be kindness. Good night, everybody.